welcome to this evening's Press Spaces session. Phil said, introduce who you are and where you're from. Yeah, I never like to assume that people. That's always a bit rude to assume that people know who you are. So I'm from Colchester in Essex, where Julie Swan and her lovely husband visited for a few years, only a very few years, and then they left again. So we've been the poorer ever since. But I work in Colchester, lead a team of people, amazing people who are chaplains in schools all over the town. So we deliver or support chaplaincy in all but one of the state secondary schools in the town and both of the FE colleges. So we've got one state secondary school left, which doesn't have it. There's only one secondary school that doesn't have a chaplain here. So anyway, and we also run a whole load of different kinds of projects in schools. So Sanctum, which is what we call our prayer space for secondary schools, which we've been running since 2008. So we go back a while. And I'm going to run a 2-week version of that in a fortnight's time in a school, which is very exciting. 2 whole weeks of being there. We also have a whole load of other projects. Beloved, which is a kind of self-esteem course for girls, year 8 girls. Unrepeatable, which is our vocations space, which very, very tightly focused around helping young people to understand themselves before they approach the world of work. So that rather than just kind of shopping around for a job and hoping that they hit the right one, they go into the careers market or into the further education market knowing themselves better. And we've got that running next week. It's just lovely to see young people discovering themselves through that. So we run that for year 10s or year 12s. And then we did a thing in the summer called Refresh, which is kind of, we stumbled upon prayer spaces and everything else we've ever done since then looks like a prayer space. But Refresh was about giving young people a way to reflect on the year and a bit of pandemic that we've been through up to that point. What did they want to let go of that had been rubbish? What did they want to hold on to that had been good? And what were their hopes and dreams for the future that without COVID that was sort of beginning to creep over the horizon like a slow dawn? And so we ran that in 4 schools and 3 FE colleges at the end of the summer term and beginning of the autumn term. Again, that just the methodology of a prayer space, of a reflective space, however you want to phrase it, but tightly focused around a particular theme can be so powerful. So we did that. And then we've got a few other things that we do as well. So we're kind of a mixture of chaplaincy, which is the ongoing pastoral and spiritual life stuff in schools, and then also doing these projects that just give some specific high profile to particular themes or ideas, and just kind of arrest young people's attention and give them a way of exploring for themselves and discovering things about themselves that are good and wholesome and lovely and life affirming and everything, all the stuff that you already know about prayer spaces. So that's a little bit about us. There's me, there's a team of other chaplains. Some of them we pay, some of them volunteer with us, some of them are nothing to do with us except that we support them and the work that they do. So Colchester, we're nearly there, whole town with a chaplain in every school. Will we get there? I don't know. So that's us. We've been aware that, obviously we're all aware of the horrendous situation in Ukraine, which has sort of appeared on our screens within less than a fortnight. We've had less than a fortnight of this, and yet it feels like it's been forever. And we know that that's having it is having an impact on children and young people. If they've had anxiety already, it's sort of adding to that. And so we've gathered a few links, but just to go through the gist of some of what we've spotted already, the advice about how do we speak helpfully to children and young people who are disturbed by all this. Just a few very quick points. Age appropriate. Make sure that the way we're talking to them is age appropriate. It's appropriate to whether they're teenagers or 6-year-olds or anything in between. Try and be age appropriate about that. If you want to watch something together, BBC Newsround, brilliant. It's designed for a younger audience. So just the Beeb does this really, really well. So maybe that's, if you want to watch something together, maybe that's the thing to watch together. Listen, let them. All the advice suggests listen. We all know this really, but let them know let them tell you what they know, and let them tell you what they understand about what's going on and what worries them, so that be careful not to impose our understanding or our knowledge into their world. They may know enough for them, and that's enough. And it's really important that we don't load on them the stuff that we might be carrying in terms of our understanding and knowledge. Content. I thought this is a really brilliant thing about content and balance. So there's a whole lot of awful stuff about destruction and bombing and death and all of that sort of thing. But we need to balance conversation with news, with the good news bits that are popping out. So stuff around peace initiatives that are, even if they're flawed, even if they're failing, there are people who are trying to have conversations to bring a peace about. The response of the world standing up to President Putin, not necessarily to Russian people, but to a regime that is inflicting this. The world is standing up against this. The world is standing up against the bully. So that's a sort of a language and idea that children and young people will understand. The protests against this war that are happening in many cities around the world, including in Russia, there are people protesting about this. If you feel this is a bad thing, which you will, other people say it's a bad thing too. You're not alone in what you feel and think about this. Stories of hope and grace. Every now and then there is a little good news story that pops out. You might have seen that clip of Ukrainians letting a captured Russian soldier phone home. These are stories of grace and of hope, and they're a helpful counterbalance to some of the horrors that we see. There are people who are being loving in this, even towards their enemy. And also just the whole wave of prayer from across the world about Ukraine. Yeah. So you hunt for the snippets of good news to balance some of the terrors and the horror of what is also going on. Modeling good news consumption. So some of us can be a bit fixed to our phones a bit, and our children or young people are going to notice that, and we might need to moderate some of our news consumption to model that well with our children and young people that are in our orbit. And then the other thing that lots of people are saying is be aware of your mood, because your mood about this whole situation will be picked up by your child. They will mirror what you say or feel or how you're reacting to things. So there we go. So I've got here we go. Let me post this. He does some magic in that should work. There we go. So there are 4 links that we've trawled through. We've read through dozens of links, so you don't have to. And there's a few there that we found that are particularly helpful, and I've just kind of prefaced them with just a note about what I feel they're doing. So if those are helpful to you, that's great. You might have found other helpful stuff. There is a lot of stuff out about how to talk to children and young people about this with different emphasis, but we found those 4 are really good. So I'll leave that with you. Also, we've got some prayer activities. Phil, tell us a bit, just in a couple of minutes, what have we done about prayer activities around Ukraine?
Ebony, who's hiding somewhere on this call, I think, does 6 prayer activities. Ebony, do you want to tell us about them?
Hi, yeah, absolutely. Here I am. Yeah, so we've just created 6 prayer activities to help children and young people pray for what's happening in Ukraine. And so we sort of structured some of them off of Pete Gregg's prayer. And so we looked at praying for Ukraine as the nation, praying for leaders, both for Putin, other international leaders, as well as the Ukrainian leaders, praying for peace and praying for those who have left home and had to flee from their homes, just things like that. So less helping children process their feelings, I'd say, but more intercessory activities. Yeah, is there anything else you want to say, Phil?
No, I think they do help process feelings. I think just giving voice to some of the struggles, some of the questions, some of the anxiety. They're simple ways for children and young people to feel involved in something that feels overwhelming, and they're positive as well. So yeah, I think Ebony's done a great job in creating some very simple activities that can be used either as part of a larger prayer space or as individual activities within a children's group, youth group, or in a classroom, that kind of thing. So good job.
Great. So you can go and have a look at those later, see if they help you or inspire you, or are a starting point for a prayer space that you could develop and create that will work for you. So this evening, we're in these prayer spaces sessions recently, we've been going through the 4 dimensions of relational spirituality that that we alighted upon when we did the research project back in 2017. And so they are me and myself, me and others, me and the world, and me and the sacred or divine. And so this evening we want to look at me and myself. In some ways, this is like the most central of relationships, me and myself. If I'm not at peace with myself and with my own identity, then I struggle with the other 3 dimensions. And we might experience that ourselves, or we know people that have done that. And many of us are working with children and young people who are encountering low levels of self-esteem or poor mental health, or are affected by issues like Ukraine that we've just talked about. So this evening we want to hear from a couple of brilliant prayer space practitioners, Catherine Simpson and Paul Sanderson, and they're going to help us to understand 2 things in particular. Firstly, how can prayer spaces help pupils develop a healthy sense of identity? So what is it that makes a prayer space really work for children and young people so that they can be affirmed in their identity, so they can reflect on their own character and purpose, and come out of that feeling encouraged, inspired, more positive about themselves? And then secondly, recognizing that yes, there is a bit of a mental health crisis going on among children and young people, exacerbated by 2 years of a pandemic and now a war in Europe, and probably other things that are going on in their lives. But given that young people with some mental health issues will be coming through our prayer spaces are kind of uniquely places where young people have a chance to be open about these things, to express them in different ways, possibly to find that they can talk about these things in a way they've never been able to talk to before. So in that case, how do we support pupils who get upset in a prayer space, who raise a concern about what they've said, who are distressed by what they discover about themselves, or the opportunity they have to talk about a situation that is really upsetting them? What do we do then? How do we manage all that? So Phil is going to take us through the process of interviewing these 2 lovely people. I think it's Paul's coming on first, isn't he? So I'll hand over to Phil, who can introduce our 2 interviewees tonight. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim, and massive welcome to Paul. Paul, you can introduce yourself in a moment, but just to say, my first really formative experience of Paul was at the start of 1990. I was spending a year working at Paul's church. In fact, his dad was leading the church down in Surbiton. And Paul and I and his wife-to-be, I don't think, were you married at the time?
No, we were married.
Yeah. Married at the time. And the other girl that was placed with me at the church, we were secretly planning a trip to Romania. It was back before the changes in Eastern Europe, the Berlin Wall was still up, all that kind of stuff. And so we were secretly planning this trip in 1989. And then Ceausescu was shot in Romania, the Berlin Wall, everything just went nuts, 1989. And the organisation we were working with basically said to us, go, fill your van of stuff, get out there to the orphanages in Romania, go. So we drove across Europe at the very start of 1990, all the way across to Romania, and then drove back via the slowly dismantling Berlin Wall and chipped a chunk off it. So I have very fond memories of this fella from a very, very long time ago. Paul, it's a delight to have you here. Tell us briefly where you are, what you do, and then let's get into these questions.
Evening, everybody. Thank you for making time tonight. My name is Paul Sanderson. I'm chaplain at 2 academies, part of the Woodard chain. I've been chaplain at the Littlehampton Academy for 13 years. And for the last 3 years, I've given up 2 days a week in Littlehampton. I travel over to the Sir Robert Woodard Academy that's been chaplainless before I arrived for 2 years. So now they've had a chaplain in place, just 2 days, but it's kind of 2 full-time jobs, each one congregation of 1,300 students and about 100 staff. and of course the parents as well, that I listen, I serve, I encourage, inspire, and try and get them involved in making a difference through their lives and in their lives.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. And you have some letters after your name, don't you?
Well, I remember doing a quiz night once on the estate where I used to run a community project, and my fellow quizmaster, who was a comedian like me, said, one of our naughty boys from the estate said, that guy's got more letters after his name than you, because he'd just been recently given an ASBO. So it topped my MBE by one letter.
What did you get your MBE for?
Services, I'll try and pronounce it as the officer did at Buckingham Palace, for services to young people in Sussex. So there you go, for services to children, young people and families in Sussex.
Well, we're even more privileged to have you here with us tonight. Thank you very much, Paul.
I'm part of something I don't believe in and doesn't actually exist, but you know, it has its pleasures.
That aside, it's great to have you. Paul, let's just get into this question. I know that the sort of sense of thriving amongst young people is important to you. You've worked hard alongside young people for many years, and you've used prayer spaces. I know you've got a brilliant space at Woodard's at the Littlehampton Academy there. Tell us a little bit about from your perspective, what is it that makes prayer spaces work in terms of children and young people's self-identity?
I think it's allowing young people that moment. Our students rotate around. They have 3 minutes in a space, whether it's forgiveness, whether it's self-esteem, whether it's what's bubbling up. And we make it very clear that this is an individual journey, that you'll be with 3 or 4 other students, but please respect each other and allow that single time, allow that moment of your own, allow that peace that comes, allow that silence that's there when you are writing on a post-it note, or you're sitting there reflecting in the sand. And you know, I believe in team. I'm a massive team player, but I think prayer space gives you that individual moment to pause and to stop and to allow the silence to move, because we give them permission for that. And there's an atmosphere that's often created that is calm and peaceful in the chaos that is secondary school. So for me, I think one of the great things is there is that up a mountain moment that they get without us having to explain why Jesus went up a mountain. There is that silence where they only know about silence during the fire escapes and when they're in inclusion unit, or it's a fire drill. We try and reclaim silence and allow silence to be the thing that's okay. And in that silence, they hear so much about their own heartbeat. They hear so much about their own emotions as they start to cry sometimes, or they hear their friend crying and they may have missed that. So yeah, for me, it's that solo journey they go on as a small group that's about that pausing.
One of the things I found surprising about prayer spaces when I first got involved in hosting them was how any sort of being still area was really popular. You know, I kind of assumed that the more sort of colourful, vibrant, doing something activities would be the more popular ones, but almost every prayer space I've been involved with, it's the stillness stuff, the calm jars, the whatever areas that are attractive. And you just made me think of it as you were talking about stillness. I suppose for most young people, they don't have opportunities for stillness elsewhere in their life. Are there examples of this, Paul, where that you can think of, where you've observed the impact that this sort of space has had on some of the young people you've worked with?
Yeah, I mean, we're privileged. I have a chapel space, and then we use another classroom as well. So we have lots of geography that we can use. So we have a big indoor tent that's blacked out, and then the classic bubble tube, the giant bubble tube, sits in the middle, bean bags around the outside, something very mellow from Moby playing in the background. And you create almost this womb-like environment. And for many young people who are living with anxiety and the stresses and strains, you know, psychologists would say that fetal position that we go into, what we're watching on the TV screens, people, when they jump to the floor from a bomb going off, they automatically go into that fetal safety position. And we accidentally or purposely create these fetal moments where they're suddenly a bit safe and a bit secure. And there's a heartbeat that they can hear of a rhythm music, or even it's quiet enough for their own heartbeat. And so our bubble space is often the one where, when we reflect back at the end of the hour-long class with our students that have come through, which has been the moment that means the most, that you're reflecting on right now, and they will point to the tent. And it was in there, in those 3 minutes, when I looked at what's bubbling up in my life, And I realized the good and the bad in it all. And some of it I'd never told anyone before. So I told a post-it note anonymously and I stuck it on there. And I watched as the oxygen and as the water and as the light, the things that bring life into our darkness were there behind it. And all of that imagery and all of that symbolism and indeed some of that moment that we've created, for me, it's womb-like, and it just takes them to a very safe space.
Is this, do you feel like young people make this journey on their own, or what role does you play or do other hosts play in a context like that, in a prayer space?
We take the risk. We are the ones that are prepared to say reflection, pausing, prayer is okay. We think you're going to get something out of it. We even ask them to take their shoes off to have that humour dynamic. No one's ever refused to take their shoes off, even though so many people have got a real journey with their feet. And so we take lots of risks, and they're all in it together. So there is a community. And then, of course, as I said, they go off into their individual spaces. But I think it's that risk element. We're prepared to be confident in the material because we've used it, we've done it, I've seen it works. There was a generation, because we're doing our 13th at the end of this month, our 13th prayer space. And so there is a generation that talked about it, Wait for Prayer Space Week. The legacy is on the chapel space. They see last year's, or in our case, 2 years ago's public one, where people came into the chapel. So there's an expectation, there's the risk taking, and there's a kind of off you go. Try it out, see what happens. And there's a spirituality amongst young people that is so hungry. And of course, this is a Christian chapel, I'm a Christian, but we keep very clear this is about you discovering about you and maybe something bigger than you that can engage in you at your moment of forgiveness or self-esteem or rejection or whatever the space might be. And in some of those moments, you can't help if there's a cross there or something, there's conversations and questions about Christ, but it's very generic, it's very open, but of course in a chapel space, with all the prayer that's gone on before and after it, to God, reveal yourself in whatever way you choose to these young people and the staff in these moments that they'll have.
What do you do? Tim mentioned this earlier. Obviously, sometimes pupils do get upset. Sometimes the activity does bring something to the surface. I remember sitting with a sixth former in a school where I was hosting a prayer space. They were doing a forgiveness activity, had the headphones on, and this girl was just weeping and weeping and weeping. What do you, that must happen for you? What do you do in those circumstances? How do you respond to the times when things have come to the surface for a young person?
In my role as chaplain, part of my job description is tier catcher. So there is an element of, I train up the volunteers that come in. We get often older generation that come in. We have to train them gently and carefully, that they're not there to solve the students' problems, or they're there the moment. Actually just allow the tears to flow, to obviously bring to our attention if we've not spotted it, make sure there's plenty of tissues available, but just to allow tears to flow. For some young people, this is the first time they've expressed publicly some of the emotions of the tears on the pillow that happen at night, but never publicly. And of course, with child protection hats on, I can, in the school, follow up individual cases if that's required. But I think often our prayer spaces, are fast moving, rotate round to the next prayer zone. Some will just stay there. Some will just stay in self-esteem for the whole hour because that's where they need it right there and then. And it's permission to do that. In my desire for them to experience and to be exposed to all the prayer spaces, I never want to move someone on who clearly is having their God moment and something is happening. We don't know what. Tears often are their expression of that. And so we catch them where needed. We sit in silence, and my team are trained just to sit in silence alongside them. Obviously, physical contact is only where it's appropriate and needed, and always public, and always same sex, if that's an arm around the shoulder, if it's getting that deep. But just allowing. And what we find is there's very little judgment by other young people for tears, and maybe tears can be a little bit contagious as well. So who's out crying each other? And you have to manage that quite carefully, because you do have some students, oh, they're crying, so I better cry as well. But just allowing it to happen. And reaffirming it's okay to not be okay, because this is part of the journey. This is part of maybe the healing process of whatever it is that's bubbling up in you. So it's permission of time to do it. It's the practicality of, let's not rush them on to the next thing now. Allow the volunteer to sit with them in silence and to, yes, when the tears have dried up a bit, maybe they've moved on, and for me it's break time, I can then follow them up as an individual, say, okay, is there anything you want to share? And I have that privilege because I'm there 24/7, as it were. I can follow up and pick up on that.
And I just spotted Janet put up a comment in the chat there, which is probably a good one to raise, Paul. Is there a difference, you think, in how a chaplain, a staff member, responds to a pupil who's upset to maybe one of your volunteers who you've kind of trained on the hoof, sort of thing? How would you handle that?
Yeah, I think the volunteers' motive is great, but they'd be wanting to get straight in there and pray. Depending on the level of church they've come from, maybe cast out a few things. I don't know. We obviously make it very clear that's not what's going on here. So it is, I float around. I try not to be in charge of a space, so I am floating around, particularly aware of self-esteem, bubble tube, and forgiveness. They're the three areas I found in my 13 years that rightly just draw it out and allow the rucksack to be emptied of what they've been carrying of anger and resentment. And that natural weight that's lifted off is just a sense of tears flow, sometimes tears of joy, not just necessarily sadness, and that confusion of that is okay. So yes, my role as chaplain is I know the history, I know the backlog. I can even go online and check their CPOMs, which is the child protection register we have, of okay, this might be surfacing. I can follow that up very bespoke if required, and that's what my job would be to do, because I'm there the next day, whereas the volunteer isn't. So volunteers, be there, sit with them, pass the tissues, log it to me who it was, and then pray internally in your own mind while you're sitting there.
Very interesting. What I've picked up from you here, Paul, is that the tears are okay. I think often we kind of have that need to fix things quickly in us, and we can over respond sometimes, whereas in a safe environment, tears may be okay. And sometimes you said pupils can care for one another. There can be sort of peer support going on as well as adult support. Just before I move on to Catherine, Paul, go on.
One of the interesting challenges on a couple of occasions, it's been teachers, the staff that have come with the class, who have literally broken down, and they've said, look, I'm going to have to leave. And I said, that's fine. They've gone to their own space because they felt it was inappropriate in front of students to cry. But then, of course, I followed that afterwards. So you do recognise that your volunteers and teachers will be impacted, not just by the environment, but by their own journey that they're on. And everybody's on a different journey, as we know, at a different speed. And for some reason, prayer spaces speed up something. They meet a person where they're at right now, that hours of therapy or alcohol or something has not been able to unlock. Suddenly in a spare space, something is loosened, and tears are part of the oiling of that loosened. So yes, it's the adults, the volunteers as well. Sorry, Phil.
No, I've experienced that too with teachers who sneaked in when other pupils aren't there because they want to do the activities and talk. So just really quickly, how have you been responding to the Ukraine crisis? Are there specific things that you've been doing and observing with the pupils?
Okay, I'm on screen share now, hopefully. So what you're seeing in the background is our pillars of hope. I work in 2 schools, as you can see in that image, that film clip that I made as part of the assembly that's going out this week to introduce them, are our 4 pillars of hope. And the students have got blue cards that they can use, and those cards will be available for them. And the cards look like this. Bear with me a second. Okay, I got them written somewhere else. So the cards look like this, and then they'll be transferred over to my chapel. So this is the chapel space here. In one of my, I'm privileged. Hey, I'm a lucky guy. I've got 2 chapels in 2 locations, 2 normal state secondary schools that are academies, and this is our one chapel. So at the moment, obviously, this is the prayer wall that we've got there, where you can see the clump of stuff around Central Europe.
Paul, we can only see.
Hear me?
We can hear you, but we can only see the pillars of hope. We can't see the chapel.
Okay. So how do I? Oh, that's interesting. So let's close that one down then. I see what's happened. How does that do it now for you? Can you see it now?
I can see you and me now.
Okay, so I've got to do. I see how it works now. Sorry, it's been a while. There we are.
There we go.
So there's our world map. There's our world map that is in. It tells me participants can now see your application. There's our world map. You can see a cluster of post-it notes that's been added. If you can zoom into the central part of Europe, those have been transferred over from some of our pillars of hope. And a lot of the journey, just to overlink to the 2 questions, is this new mantra that I'm helping students to embrace is: you are loved, you are free, your life has meaning. I know there's a self-esteem question coming up, or I've hogged the time and it's not coming up. But for me, staff and students, this has been the thing through COVID, that they've forgotten that they're loved. They feel very trapped. And I believe there's a real freedom that can come. And actually their life has a purpose and a meaning beyond the screen. And so there's a reminder of that for those that had already got it, or for those that have been self-harming and feel, what's the point in my life? Grabbing hold of this heartbeat of Jesus's life, that they're loved, unconditionally loved no matter what, is right there at the heart of the chapel, both chapels. And that there is a freedom, I believe, that's possible, that we are free, albeit we're so shackled and tied back by what we see on our screens, by the fear that comes. Today, a student comes to me and said, Paul, are we going to die? This war, are we going to die? And it was genuine. And it was a 12-year-old girl, genuine, and what she'd watched and seen on TikTok. So we just had a moment within the chapel, looking at the wall, saying, you're loved, you're free, and your life has meaning. And yes, we are going to die one day, but not as a result of a nuclear bomb on Littlehampton, or indeed, I believe, on this world. And so these are our first waves of actions. We've got our prayer space coming up in 3 weeks' time. We're doing all of our assemblies this coming 2 weeks on the situation there, with our discussion time. Today I met with our 3 Russian students. Tomorrow we're meeting with our 24 Russian speaking students from Latvia and Lithuania, offering support, making sure they're okay. Our Belarusian student has already received quite hateful messages because of their second name and the situation. So we're working in both sides. So we have the Ukraine flag outside the chapel, and of course you see our Russian flag there with many of the flags from the countries of students that we support. So it's happening one-to-one, supporting the individuals. It's happening on a bigger scale, helping our young people understand what is going on, and reassuring them of safety, as was so brilliantly helped out at the beginning there with Tim, and reminding them that they're loved, they're loved, they're loved, they're loved, and that freedom is possible, and their life, every single one, every life in Ukraine has meaning, and their life has meaning. And it's so important we try and get that. It's so important that we try and get that across, particularly in these days where we're seeing life has no meaning on our screens, on our TikToks. We've got to get it across these young people. Their life has meaning. I'll shut up now. Sorry, Phil.
Don't apologise. That was great, Paul. Thank you very much. I'm gonna bring Catherine in now, so we can ask Catherine some similar questions. And then we are going to split off into some breakout rooms. If you have questions that are coming up, please pop them in the chat. I think Paul's going to stick around to the end now as well, because he's already watched his programme with his wife earlier. So he's free for the evening. So we'll be able to chuck some questions back at Paul and Catherine afterwards. Catherine, welcome. Tell us briefly who you are, where you are, what you do.
Okay, I'm Catherine Simpson. I'm in the Diocese of Durham. I just need to say my internet is a bit unstable tonight. Not like me, really, you know, feeling the same instability as the internet. So my job in the Diocese of Durham at the moment is on growing faith, which is encouraging churches and schools to work more closely together, and also to develop school chaplaincy. So I was a school chaplain in a primary school for 8 years before taking up this post in Durham.
Brilliant. It's so good to have you here, Catherine. From the sort of primary school perspective there, what's been your sort of observations, your experience of the impact that prayer spaces have on children's self-esteem, their sense of self-identity, and, you know, are there particular things that you've sort of developed to focus on that?
I think one of the things I love about prayer spaces more than anything is that it kind of normalizes the big questions and the big feelings. And sometimes younger children don't have the language, they can't articulate kind of what's going on. And prayer spaces just allow them to explore those big feelings and those big questions in different ways. And I think it's a bit of a leveler, isn't it, prayer? I think nobody's got the monopoly on it, and I see, you know, that prayer isn't pretending that everything is okay or persuading God that we want it to be okay. For me, it's about offloading, and I think young children need to do that just as much as adults do, or teenagers, and we mustn't underestimate their capacity to do that and to communicate with God. It might not be in the kind of shiny language that we use, that we're used to, but the children never cease to teach me many things about prayer and just being with God. And I think prayer spaces are an amazing resource to facilitate that. Yeah, I mean, there's so much I could say. I mean, post-pandemic, I sort of arranged and wrote quite a few prayer spaces on sort of emotional well-being and mental health. And I have to say, the children gave me most of those ideas. It wasn't, you know, and again, I think it's about talking to young people and children. It's about listening to them and listening to what their concerns are. We can second guess as to what they're worried about or what they're thinking, but actually we need to listen, and we might be surprised sometimes. Ebony's asking me when I put a PowerPoint together simply so that there was something to look at other than me. So anytime, Ebony, just flick through them, that's fine. So yeah, one of the stations, if we go on to the next slide, it really kind of just sums up what I've been talking about there, and about not pretending that everything's okay. And with the situation in Ukraine, none of us are okay with it. None of us have the answers, and I think it's just about creating those spaces and those opportunities to kind of sit in a safe space and be scared and to ask God those questions. And I think we've got, as kind of adults or facilitators, we've got to be okay with not having all the answers. And that can be hard for us, because I think we always think we've got to jump in there and like I say, when children are getting upset, we feel like we've got to go in and fix it. But actually, tears aren't always a bad thing. We sometimes just need to let it out, don't we? And there aren't the answers, and I think God can meet us in that. So next slide will show you some Lego heads. And one thing with younger children I always tried to do was use things that were familiar to them in prayer spaces. So obviously most kids love Lego, quite a lot of adults love Lego as well, and it was just things that they could identify with, that they could feel safe with, that they weren't sort of alien to them. So another one I've used, which is on the next slide, was beads of loss. And again, it's just a real child friendly thing that they're familiar with, but it's, you know, talking about, you know, bereavement and loss and processing those huge feelings that as adults we struggle with, and we've got the language, you know, for children. And it reminds me again of talking and listening to kids. I remember I had to go into a class one day, and one of the children, the mum had died really suddenly, and I had to go in and talk to the class about this. And the things that I thought the kids would be freaked out about weren't necessarily true. And it was only through talk, you know, one of the kids was distressed because she was worried that her mum was going to die suddenly for no apparent reason. And it's kind of those, like, we mustn't make assumptions and we mustn't dismiss kind of their concerns and their worries. Next slide, just to, again, so you're not looking at me. Self-esteem, massive issue. And I think we often think that this is more of a teenage issue, and perhaps it does come to more of a head, but I was seeing younger and younger children when I was in primary school struggling with issues around self-esteem and eating disorders and just body positivity, and like it's quite scary. It's like, you're 8, what you worrying about, that your hair's not perfect and your mum won't let you wear your lip gloss for school, you know. But these are very real tensions in our young people and children, and again, it's creating spaces to enable them to hear the alternative message that is countercultural, that, you know, you are amazing, that God loves you, that, you know, none of us are perfect. And it's all those things that we know, but there's something powerful about doing it in a prayer space. And this was amazing, this one. If we go on to the next slide.